Dobrý večer, vítajte. Vítajte v Berlínke. Vítajte na ďalšom zo sérii Open Studio. Dovolte mi, aby som prešiel plynule zo slovenského jazyka do angličtiny, keďže tu máme amerického hostia a vlastne takže ďalej budeme pokračovať v angličtine. So for the beginning, let me say a few words about Open Studio. Open Studio just runs 7 years now, so it's already seventh year, and this series of lectures, performances, screenings, meetings, and consultations are part of the program of Ilona Nemet in studio at the Academy of Fine Arts and Design in Bratislava, and this time in collaboration with Transit. I am here to speak for Ilona Nemet, who cannot be here tonight. She's right now in Prague, so she asked me to introduce Paul and to introduce her project here tonight. So I will not speak longer. I would just like to express my pleasure that for this moment that Paul is here tonight with us, because we have been dealing with curatorial thought. We have been dealing with exhibition making and with reflection on exhibitions, especially focused on Eastern Europe. But now, or not only now, but we have already few more lectures dealing with the, let's say, global situation in curating. So it's a great pleasure tonight to introduce this lecture dealing with the issue we are interested in, and I hope that the problems, questions, issues raised tonight will generate even more questions and discussions which will proceed during this evening, or maybe tomorrow or the day after. Okay, so let me now pass the mic to Judith Angel, the director of Transit SK.
Thank you, Daniel, for your introduction. I would also like to welcome Paul and also you. Thank you for coming. I just would like to tell you the reason Transit SK is very happy to have Paul O'Neill now as a lecturer. It is, you know, that our exhibitions we have in Transit Space, they are pursuing various curatorial practices and exhibition models. And we had a lot of lectures in various domains of contemporary art discourse, but we never had until now one dedicated especially to curating and curatorship, the so-called curatorial. And Paul is an expert in this topic, so that's why we are particularly glad that we have him here in this evening. So I would like to briefly introduce Paul O'Neill to the audience. So he is artist, curator, educator, writer, and he is based in Bristol and in New York. He is currently director of graduate program at Bart Center for Curatorial Studies in New York. He co-curated over 50 exhibitions over the world, and he has held lecturing positions at Goldsmiths College in London, at Middlesex University, and he is also international tutor at the Apple curatorial program in Amsterdam. He started early his practice in curating and researching the so-called curatorial, and lately his writings, so he is regular contributor to Art Monthly and also a series of books, among them a curatorial anthology called Curating Subjects, and then also his authorial work, The Culture of Curating and Curating of Culture. And together with Mick Wilson, he co-edited two seminal books. One is Curating and the Educational Turn, and the other is Curating Research. I found this small statement on Paul's website. I like it very much, and I would like to share. So his is interested in addressing the systems of that are involved in the world around us, and the compulsions that led to interpretation and meaning itself. And he is doing a lot of curatorial projects, but also art, discursive events, writing, lecturing. So he will introduce us in his lecture. So thank you for coming, and now we are looking forward to your presentation.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks to Judith and everybody who's been involved in getting me here. And I also want to say a big thank you to the Transit Network more generally. I think they're an incredible network of thinkers, curators, and artists, art historians, teachers, educators, citizens in this part of the world, and you're very lucky to live in such proximity from each of those collectives. Can everybody hear me okay? Is it very loud or is it very dim? It's fine. This is a kind of a prelude before I start. I'm going to move between a lot of different thematics, a lot of different terms will be employed and extrapolated, and perhaps some light will be shared on them or shed on them over the course of 50 minutes to an hour. I had two versions which I prepared. I prepared a long version and I prepared a shorter version. You'll be happy to know that I'm about to present the shorter version. But the shorter version requires you to stay for the whole duration. There will be a particular moment where you perhaps can leave. I mean, you can leave now if you wish. But when we get onto the subject of escape, I would prefer if everybody remains here for the last, say, 20 minutes. So when I start to talk about escape, I will read a text which you will become part of in a way. Okay, if that's okay with everybody. So I'm going to start with some things I know and some things I don't yet know. And then there are other things that I know very well, and there are some things that I am completely uncertain about. And I'm going to move between the things that I know very well and the things that I'm uncertain about. And perhaps somehow the uncertainties in relation to what I don't know will shed some light on the things that I know and vice versa. So some of the material I've covered elsewhere in pieces of writing, but also in previous lectures. And then some things that I'm uncertain about will hopefully unravel some of the clarity of my thinking or clarity of the articulation of those ideas. It's quite awkward holding this and doing lots of different things, so forgive me if I physically look a bit uncomfortable. When she was 43 years old, after struggling with addiction and mental illness for many years, the artist took her own life. The repetitive picking of one's own skin, excoriation, the body's glandular reaction to a handful of hastily prescribed psychotropic meds, the use of opiates to strike a balance between numbness and pain, sometimes reaching a plateau where one can feel and even think. Unicorns and force fields, sweetness, sparkles, little dogs, and light. The storefront studio on Sunset Boulevard, where the artist also lived, was a storeroom and a lab, to which domestic touches had been added over many years as it became clear that this would be her permanent domain. She'd said, Some things in life are really harsh and troubling, and if you can find a way to be less cynical, well, all the better. Thinking, you know, can be completely suicidal. Sometimes it's better just to zone out. So that's, that's one of 18 short stories written by the artist, writer, filmmaker Chris Kraus. And Chris was one of the first artists that I commissioned for this project called We Are the Centre for Curatorial Studies, which is the project that I'm primarily going to focus on this evening. And it's a 3-year project which announces itself publicly in different ways across a span of the 3 years. And I will show you some images of the first phase, which opened last October at the Centre for Curatorial Studies, Bard College. And before I do that, I just want to move through, like, a lot of my thinking over the last maybe 15 years has been really thinking about the exhibition as a kind of a spatial organism, as something which has these different kind of groundings which make it an exhibition, has different kind of properties and modalities that make it an exhibition in a way that a painting is a painting, the way in which an exhibition is different from a painting because of these properties and modalities that make them different. But I've been primarily focusing on a kind of a spatial metaphor, and a spatial metaphor of the landscape, which is something which surrounds you, and that you cannot conceive of it, or you cannot, it is too large, it is too gigantic in order for you to completely perceive it in its totality. Where secondly, there's a kind of a middle grounding activity where things that you can interact with and you can control and you can arrange and you can adopt technically. So things like lighting, things like seating, things like the floor, things like the point, the level from the floor to the middle of the picture, and various different things. This is what I call middle ground activities, but it's still a kind of a middle ground if you think of like an image of a landscape. And then the foreground is that which comes into the gallery or the museum intact and then leaves the gallery or the museum intact. And mostly they are works of art. They're works of art which have certain conditions under which they should be shown, and there are certain conditions under which they should be preserved and protected after they are exhibited. And with this particular phase of We Are the Centre for Curatorial Studies, the exhibition, phase 1, I've been trying to think more so, less about this kind of spatiality of the form of the exhibition, and also less about what has predominated, or what has dominated curatorial thinking over the last, certainly over the last 30 to 40 years. And I'm really talking about like a technical thing here rather than a kind of a political thing here, but all technical things also have their kind of political register. But this idea that to curate is to put things together, and in putting these things together, they somehow speak about each other, and in putting two things together, a third thing emerges because of the relationship between the first two things. So this is what you call is kind of a juxtapositional way of reading exhibitions. So things next to one another are speaking to each other, but they're also saying something differently of each other because of their close proximity to one another. In a way in which, and many curators curate in that way. They put things together and things speak to one another and say things to each other in order to shed new light on them. I'm less interested about those two things. Less interested in the spatiality of the exhibition, less interested in the idea of collage or montage or juxtaposition. I'm more interested in this idea of an exhibition as something which becomes, something which emerges through a series of sites of contact. That is when things come in contact with one another, and what I would call, I'm calling them more like bodies, when bodies come in contact with other bodies. So when a body comes into contact with another body, what is happening with these two bodies? What is the kind of weightfulness, or the weight, what kind of emergent ontological being is being kind of foregrounded? So for example, what happens when this painting, which is a small painting by an artist, Willie McKeown, sits on top of wallpaper, which is also a work by the same artist, William McKeown. What happens when this painting and this wallpaper come into contact with one another? What is it that emerges? What is it that's being somehow exhibited? So I'm ultimately arguing that the moment of the exhibition is when the thing we called art becomes an exhibition. It no longer remains art. It moves away from its status as being art into this status of being an exhibition. So when you take that painting, which is a very small painting, and it was last shown in 2007. It's a painting which I showed before in 2007 when the artist William McKeown was alive. And it's a very, very light painting. It's a very light painting that comes in a very, very big, heavy crate. And there's something really phenomenal about when you open you transport this big, heavy crate across from Europe to America, and you open this crate, and then inside it there's another box, and you open that other box, and then inside it there's some bubble wrap, and then you open this bubble wrap, and then there's tissue paper, and then inside all of these wrappings there's this tiny little painting. And this tiny little painting, when you pick it up, it's like so light. I mean, it's lighter than a single sheet of paper. It's like this light. So this painting, which has so much weight, when it sits on this wall, when it sits on top of this wallpaper, when these two things are kind of placed together, when these two bodies come into contact with one another, there's a kind of an emergent weight to them. So there's a kind of a density to the relationship between these two bodies in contact with one another. Where in fact, so in a sense, when you take the painting out of the crate, when it's like you pick it up and it's like almost like too light to actually lift. It has this kind of phenomenological quality, which is, and then you look behind it and you see all this kind of information about where it was shown and where the markings of its previous exhibition. And then you put it on the wall, and as soon as you put it on the wall, it actually just kind of gathers this kind of weight to it and this kind of a density. And I'm really interested with this exhibition, and also maybe thinking more widely about the kind of the politics of contact. So what happens when this painting comes into contact with this wallpaper? What happens when this little girl sits on a Mary Heilman chair? This is a chair by an artist, Mary Heilman, from LA, based in New York. And this is a number of her chairs that she calls painting sculptures. But what happens when this little girl sits on this Mary Heilman chair? When the Mary Heilman chair becomes something else, when a little girl basically activates this chair, where it's no longer this kind of piece of art that kind of sits on its own. What happened when Daffy Duck, this is a work by an artist called Garrett Long, what happens when Daffy Duck stands on his bed, and it's a bed that he has slept in all his life, but he sits on the bed and he realizes that the bed is too small for his body. And then he's in this kind of perpetual state of thinking about how has this happened? I've been sleeping in this bed all my life, and this bed where I always slept is somehow now too small for me. How come I can't get into this bed? So these kind of sites of contact, when Daffy comes in contact with its bed, when this little girl comes into contact with the Mary Heilman chair, when this painting comes into contact with a wallpaper work, this wallpaper work is a work that is made specifically for exhibition, meaning that it does not exist as a work until you make it. It's silk screened by hand by a printer. There's only one printer in the world that can actually make this wallpaper, and it's hand silk screened, and it's hand silk screened each time for every exhibition that it takes part in. And each time the orange will be slightly different. The proximity of the cuckoos, which are these British birds, the proximity of the two cuckoos coming into contact with another will change ever so slightly, but they never actually touch the two cuckoos. And what you'll notice also, I'll go to this. So I'm really interested in what happens when the thing we call art becomes an exhibition. What happens when Daffy sits on this chair on his bed and starts to contemplate why his body will not fit into it? What happens when the artist Nina Kanel pours gum from a pistachio tree in Iran over this kind of like piece of wood? What happens to this piece of gum is incredible, is that when she pours it, it's like this solid, like chewing gum, like a really solid chewing gum. And then when it's exposed to the elements, this solid kind of chewing gum-like material starts to kind of melt and starts to fall, and gravity takes hold, and it becomes like liquid. So a solid becomes kind of, a gummy kind of solid becomes a kind of a liquid. But then over the course of time, as it being exposed to the light and to oxygen and carbon dioxide, it goes hard again. It becomes like this crystal, this kind of crystal glass, pink kind of glass. And I'm really interested in works that are really exhibiting themselves, where the materials themselves are not, they never remain the materials themselves, but they always return. The gum always returns to being gum. Basically, at the end of the exhibition, we take all the gum, we melt it, we put it back into tin cans, and then it goes into storage and waits for the next moment it's being exhibited. What happens when Eduardo Padilha, the Brazilian artist based in London, what happens when he makes a sleeping bag out of abandoned mattresses, and then he takes these abandoned mattresses, takes the material from them, and then he stitches them into an individual sleeping bag. And what happens when these individual sleeping bags are made up of all these bodies which have been in contact with all this material, all these mattresses over the years? And I'm really invested in how this kind of body inside a body somehow is articulated. What happens when the artist Sarah Swinner takes one photograph of Tracy, which is the female figure in the photograph, and then juxtaposed it with a photograph of all these objects which are in her possession. So this is what I'm trying to do with this exhibition. And in a way, I'm arguing for a kind of exhibition making that is about cohabiting time. So being together in contradiction to one another, but at the same time that somehow the kind of temporality of this evolution of the relationships that are beholden within the exhibition structure somehow cohabits time together. I'm also very conscious, and this is an image that I've shown many times before and that I've talked about many times before, I'm also conscious of really preserving the exhibition. A lot of, like, I teach in a curatorial program, I direct a curatorial program in the States, and there's really, of course, with our current political turmoil, students and young curators are really questioning like their function as curators, but also the function of the exhibition as a political tool. And I think this is the moment where we really have to conserve and preserve the exhibition as a political forum or a political form of articulation. And these are for thinkers who have articulated or tried to articulate an idea of the curatorial which goes above and beyond the exhibition. So in a way, kind of putting the exhibition as this more staid, conservative, traditional, and the form that needs to be somehow debunked or critiqued and maybe transformed into another kind of practice which they're calling the curatorial. So Irit Rogoff, in the book on the top left-hand corner, she states that the curatorial is critical thought that does not rush to embody itself, instead raises questions that are unraveled over time. Whereas Maria Lind articulates the curatorial as involving practicing forms of political agency that try to go beyond what is already known. Beatrice von Bismarck articulates the curatorial as a continuous space of negotiation, contributing to other processes of becoming. And Emily Pettick, in The Exhibitionist, proposes the curatorial as something which presupposes an unbounded framework, enabling and allowing things, ideas, and outcomes to emerge in the process of being realized. So I'm not equally trying to debunk their articulation of the curatorial. In a way, I'm trying to employ the way in which they're thinking about the curatorial, but in the context of an exhibition form. So I'm not giving up on the exhibition form as the primary means through which the curatorial can actually gather its shape and gather its form. And I rather think about the curatorial not in the way in which they're placing it in opposition to the exhibition or exhibition making per se, but actually even also in opposition to art in some way. But I'm trying to think about the curatorial as a constellation of activities. So the way in which we imagine kind of an astral constellation of stars, that they're all independent of one another, but they're all codependent upon one another. So they kind of coexist at the same time as existing independently from one another. They need each other, but also they need each other because of their independence from one another. And in a way, this kind of shift, this shift for me in terms of thinking about the exhibition as a kind of an ontological form rather than a phenomenological form, perhaps kind of goes back to it's kind of great, like one of the biggest early kind of philosophical arguments, certainly in Western philosophy, between Heidegger and Husserl. For anybody who's familiar with the history of philosophy, Husserl was the kind of like one of the leading kind of protagonists of phenomenology, which was a kind of a theory based on the idea that we accrue. We become through the experiential. We come to know something by experiencing it. So the idea of the phenomenology was that we do not know something in advance of the experience. Whereas Heidegger disputed with Husserl that this concept of knowledge or this concept of becoming was in fact unhelpful. Because he really understood that something is there in advance of knowledge, that we know in advance of actually knowing, that somehow there is something that precedes the experiential that is us, that we know we are ourselves in advance of having to learn anything. We already know. So this was one of the greatest, like, I suppose, early kind of Western philosophical arguments between Husserl and Heidegger. And I think for Heidegger, I'm invested in both phenomenology and ontology, but I feel like this idea of existence, that's something that becomes through the act of being with, and in motion, and a movement and an evolution. Something is changing to something or someone at any particular moment, and I'm really interested in how the exhibition becomes something. So if I look back at, say, a history of, like a really short history of these moments where a concept of an exhibition became something so radically different from what precedes it that it has this kind of feeling of a kind of an ontological state. So these are very early photographs by Eugène Auger, the photographer who lived in Paris in the late 19th, early 20th century. And what's interesting me about these photographs is that Auger is photographing a moment of complete disappearance. So the disappearance of one kind of site of display, being the kind of corner store or the arcades, and being replaced by another primary form of display, which would be the department store or the supermarket and so forth. But also Auger, alongside a number of other thinkers, such as artists like Lissitzky or Alexander Dorner, Moholy-Nagy and others, were really articulating in their exhibitions. And I do think what Auger is trying to do in those photographs is present a moment of disappearance. So when one world is so radically, the one world is replaced by another world in this kind of seismic shift. And Lissitzky called this moment a moment of the crisis of subject relations, which is paramount to the kind of the emergence of the Western modern city in Paris and London, New York and so forth in the latter part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century, but also the emergence of all of these kind of vehicles to accelerate the relationship between the individual atomized subject and spaces of consumption. So the proximity between the object and the subject became kind of closer together, almost condensed through the emergence of the automobile, the train, the elevator, the escalator, and so forth. So these kind of mechanisms of transportation were also creating this kind of crisis of subject-to-subject relations, so the crisis of people relations or relationality. I'm also showing these Auger photographs and these early images just to kind of present these moments of incredible radical change in what could be conceived as the exhibition. And I think these radical moments of ontological change, when something moves from one state to a completely other state, are these moments where you can actually see the emergence of these new forms, where the being of a thing becomes a totally radical other form of ontological state. So these are photographs by Alexander Dorner, and what you have like here, I mean, many of you will know these images, but this is at the Landsmuseum in the 1920s. And what's phenomenal about these is, like, if you imagine, like, with the Auger photographs, so those shop fronts were like the same they were the same for like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and then suddenly you have these corner shops being replaced by department stores, where the things which are exhibited outside the store then move into this department store. So the relationship between the subject and the object is at this moment where there's a production of a space of consumption, where in order to conceive of the things which are in the department store, you have to enter them, you have to become a consumer in relation to the commodities. So this is like the Landsmuseum forever. This is the Landsmuseum for its entire history until the 1920s. So if you imagine one day it looks like this, and then the next day, like Friday, it looks like this, Monday it looks like this. This is a moment where the radicalness of that gesture becomes exhibition. So art stops being art. This is like art as we already knew it. This is art as has been known for many, many years, kind of bourgeois. I'm not saying this is less bourgeois, but super bourgeois, inaccessible, kind of poorly articulated, poorly understood, not for the masses, ultimately for the few. And then you have this, and then changed into these kind of what Alexander Dorner called atmosphere rooms, where the things in the museum become ordered and classified in a particular way that they actually become exhibition. They stop being art as they have already been and always been known as art, and they become something else. They become an exhibition. This is the drawing rooms in the Landsmuseum in the 1920s. This is it in 1924. So this is it in 1921. This is it in 1924. It's the same material. It's the same art per se being exhibited in these two cases. But this is an exhibition. This is a museum with a whole lot of stuff that you call art in it. Similarly, people like, as I said, Elazitsky, but also Frederick Kiesler and others try to take things away from the walls and produce these kind of more mobile, interactive display systems where the viewer or viewers could ultimately change what was being exhibited within these L and T display systems. But this is a moment where art stops being art and becomes exhibition, where then the exhibition is a moment where we conceive differently of the things which we call art. A new value system is introduced, and a new system of display is introduced, so radically different to that which precedes it, that it becomes exhibitable. Similarly, these are two very, very obvious examples, but maybe I'll try and read them differently. So this is in Robert Morris, of which many, I think many more, that shift between minimalism and conceptualism, where there's a real consideration of the site of the work, I think is also kind of important. So this is Robert Morris's mirrored cubes, and it triangulates three different things. So there's the coexistence of the mirrored cubes, which are the art object, and then you have that coexisting with the site, which is the gallery. So it's the art gallery. So So you have the art object, the art gallery, and then the third part of the equation is the viewer. So you have the art viewer. So you have the art object, the art gallery, and the art viewer. And that triangulation makes it the art as exhibition. Without any of one of those three components, the art object remains an object, the art gallery remains a gallery that's not public, and without the viewer to complete the work, there is no experience of the work itself. So in a way, I think this is a very obvious example. You know, it's a very Duchampian reading of minimalism, but I think important to make clear all the same. So similarly with Duchamp's Mile of String. So Duchamp's Mile of String is, I mean, everybody knows it, but everybody thinks of it as, not everybody, but many people have articulated as a kind of an installation which creates this kind of barrier between things, where it creates a space of inaccessibility towards the other works on display from Mondrian and various other artists. But what I think is really challenging about this this work by Duchamp is that he makes you look harder and differently at what actually is behind the Mile of String. I think this is a really radical gesture that Duchamp made. So it wasn't about blocking access to the works which were on display, it was making you look at them differently. Why should we be, 2.5 meters from an artwork in order to conceive of it? Why should we experience them with a one-to-one relationship? Why should we, why are the kind of rules and protocols around exhibiting of art unchangeable? So I'm going to just leap to the exhibition itself. So in terms of thinking about these kind of spaces of contact, so these spaces are of where bodies come into contact with other bodies. I'm equally trying to think, well, what is it that constitutes different ways in which those sites of contact or those places of contact are made possible through art and its exhibition, when art becomes exhibited. So we're kind of playfully working with these kind of 6 departments. The Department of Information, which is the textual core, of which Chris Kraus is the leading professor. Department of Display, which is the operational core, which Celine Condarelli and Elizabeth Price are part of. The Department of Images, the visual core, Department of Things, the object core, Department of Events, the discursive core, Department of Weight, and the attendant core. So these 6 departments are basically broken down into the exhibition, and they kind of interact and intersect with one another, and the borders and boundaries between them are perhaps more fluid than the language that I'm using to articulate them. So even in the way in which, like, Willie's painting comes into contact with the orange wallpaper, or the little girl sits on the Mary Heilmann chair, or her body, the weight of her body sits on the chair, or the way in which Eduardo Padilla's sleeping bag sits on the floor for you to climb inside them, or sit on top of them to look at a work by, say, artist Falco Pisano. I'm also thinking of the juxtaposition of 2 different signage systems. So this is the Center for Curatorial Studies, and this is the Hessel Museum of Art. So in a way, I'm trying to transform the Center for Curatorial Studies into an exhibition, but using the resources that are available within the Center for Curatorial Studies, and inviting artists to teach, to research, and to exhibit simultaneously across the course of 3 years. So, this is the first moment where there's one body, one institutional body comes into contact with another institutional body. So here you have We Are, which is the signage system, a different typeface, a different signage system to the CCS Bard or the Hessel Museum, which is then kind of articulated here. So we're using this kind of like idea that the exhibition, We Are the Center for Curatorial Studies, somehow will encapsulate or encroach upon that which is called the Center for Curatorial Studies. I'm just going to guide you through the exhibition. I'm not going to talk very much about the works themselves, but I want to We're 28 minutes in, and I reckon we're on time. We're nearly ready to escape. And we are going to escape. So this is a work by Chan Alte, which are a series of 3 thresholds. And these 3 thresholds are obviously the space in between the Centre for Curatorial Studies, which is here, and then the exhibition, which is We're the Centre for Curatorial Studies, on the other side. So you walk through these 3 thresholds. And then there's a series of the killing of the father. So this is, when you first go into the museum, into We're the Centre for Curatorial Studies, you will hear Lawrence Weiner have Kim Weston sing his Statements of Intent from 1968. And it's obviously an early conceptual artwork which really looks at the space of the curatorial as being dependent on the idea of reception or receivership. So the idea that it's not necessarily the artist who's making the work, it's the artist who makes the instruction that can then be interpreted by the curator, organizer, administrator, installer at the moment of reception. So you hear this when you first enter the space. You're handed a copy of Chris Krause's book. And then every week there's a talk by one of the artists. So there's a talk by Eureka Muller in the Department of Events, a talk by Elizabeth Price, Nina Cadell and Vlatka Horvat were in conversation with one another. We had about 35 talks in the course of 16 weeks. Then I'm basically just going to guide you through what I would call that which is not here. And I think that which is not here, which I will articulate a little bit more fully towards the end of this talk, but that which is not here is fundamentally the thing that we're talking about when we're describing curatorial discourse. Curatorial discourse is fundamentally a discourse around that which is not here. It's always articulating and trying to describe, represent that which is not here, the thing which is not here as in the exhibition, often through images, often through text, often through lectures like this. And it's this fundamental kind of like ontological state of the exhibition, the thing which is not here, that makes it a kind of a form of imported remoteness. So in a way, what I'm asking you to do, I'm asking you to remotely, as in with a distance, engage with the thing which is not here twice. Because I'm asking you to be at the Centre for Curatorial Studies. I'm asking you to imagine the way I'm articulating it as being a cohesive way of representing it, but I'm also asking you to engage with a series of images that are also equally trying to represent or reproduce that which is not here. And as the fundamental schizophrenic nature of the exhibition, the thing which is not here is the thing which is the primary focus of curatorial discourse. These are a series of photographs by the artist Gerard Byrne, where he photographs the back of quite famous paintings. So in a way, the Gerard's photographs were an introduction to the Department of Information, the textual core. You will also, as well as hearing Lawrence Weiner's sound work or song, Kim Weston singing his Statements of Intent, you have this kind of break from the kind of traditional historical individual figure of the curator, as in Daffy Duck. So Daffy almost stands in for like the figure of the individual curator, the authorial figure from Harold Zeman onwards. So it's the moment where the individual figure of the curator becomes somewhat dialogical. So this is a desk, which is a dialogical table, which is a work by the artist Garrett Long, where you have to sit at with one other person and engage in a conversation. And we used it quite regularly as part of our teaching at CCS. But also you have the introduction of the two cuckoos. And interesting, the two cuckoos in the wallpaper by Willie McKeown are actually they're actually facing away from one another. And even though there are moments where it looks like they're intersecting with each other, they're actually not. These are a series of photographs by an artist called James Hoff, who's a very interesting artist who works with viruses. So these are two computer viruses called Skywipers, and he translates the algorithm of the virus into a form of image making. So these are two images of two specific Skywiper viruses. Then when you go into the Department of Information, there are artists dealing with the history of curatorial studies. This is the artist Martin Beck, who's providing an installation primarily based around the exhibition designer George Nelson from the 1950s. And that's juxtaposed with a number of other exhibitions, which include an Edward Muybridge photograph, which is a series of 24 photographs, and also Aspen 5 and 6 by Brian O'Doherty, which was an exhibition in a box from 1967. Then there's the Museum of American Art, which is, some of you will be familiar with, the Museum of American Art Berlin, which is an artist project investigating the history of American exhibitions from the 1920s onwards. So this, in a sense, this is an exhibition inside an exhibition inside an exhibition. And this installation primarily looks at the curator Seth Sieglaub, who was active between 64 and 74 in New York, and is also one of the early proponents of conceptual art. And then within the Department of Information, we also took a lot of material from our archives and our library. So in a sense, activating the material that we had in the centre and incorporating them into exhibitions. This is an exhibition, a reinstall of an exhibition from Brian O'Doherty, who many of you will be familiar with, wrote the book called Inside the White Cube. And this is, these are a series of sculptures that he last showed in 1972. Actually, 3 of them he showed in 1972, and 1 hadn't been shown since 1968. He did this amazing show in Betty Parsons' gallery in the late 60s, where he made these series of sculptures and then embedded kind of a language called Ogham, which is an ancient Celtic language. And later on, he would kind of activate or write a series of plays and scripts using this language, which was a disappeared Celtic language. Then you move through, so then there's a kind of a break with all the father figures, an introduction to more kind of like aesthetic and material practice with Vlatko Horvat, Ulrike Muller. That's the chair that the little girl was sitting at. In the Mary Heilmann chair. This is a Mary Heilmann painting. That's a sculpture in the corner by Marilyn Deitman. This is a film by Grace Weir. This is a central piece, which is a work by the artist Sarah Pearce, and it juxtaposes, it's called The Meaning of Greatness. And Sarah taught a 16-week course with us at the centre around greatness, the minor and the major figures of greatness, looking at ideas of legacy, looking at ideas of the epic, looking at ideas of historiography. And in this work, she's juxtaposed 3 different figures of greatness. So the soft sculpture in the middle is a kind of a soft sculptural reenactment of a work by Richard Serra. And then the work on the left-hand side is a reenactment of an Eva Hess rope sculpture. And then behind the curtains, or behind the Richard Serra thing, is our series of drawings and sculptures that her mum made when she was an art student at Kent State College of Art and Design in the 1950s. And right the way through to the student demonstrations of 1971. Everything in this room is related to the year 1971. But Sarah's mum was very actively involved in the student demonstrations in '71, which many of you may have heard about. This is an installation by Elizabeth Price, which involves 2 films. This is an installation by Yasmina Sibitz. This is also very well-known work by Yasmina called Tear Down and Rebuild. These are the beginning of the melting of the gum by Nina Canal. As you can see, it's kind of already, this is like maybe day 3. It's already kind of an act, it's having a kind of a correspondent relationship with the weather, with the elements. The drapes or the curtains are also works by the artist Eduardo Padilla, who was commissioned to basically filter the light. The light in upstate New York is kind of incredible. But also what you realize with this museum is that it's a kind of a circle which it repeats itself in both directions. If you go left or if you go right into the museum, you're basically walking into a circle, a series of rooms which start to mirror each other on the way back around. So we were very interested in using the light as a way of capturing time across the course of 3 months. So October, November, December are 3 very, very different months in terms of how the light comes into the building. This is some Mary Heilman chairs with a Sarah Swinner film, and a curtain structure by Celine Condorelli. There's the film. There's Eduardo's sleeping bags, upon which you can rest in order to look at a film by Falco Pisano. And the Falco Pisano work is kind of a feminist reading of a book of photographs of the artist Shalida, who's very well known for his very macho public sculpture. And in a sense, she kind of breaks down the language of that book of photographs into kind of a rethinking of the forms in his sculptures. Also, if you've ever been to CCS or upstate New York, Bard College, you'll notice that there's a series of Fred Wilson sculptures outside. So in a way, the Falco Pisano's voiceover also kind of stands in for a voiceover of in relation to the Franz West sculptures. Here's the actual installation of the 2 paintings with the Willie McKeown wallpaper. Now, the sites of contact, so this is these 2 paintings I showed when Willie was alive in 2007, and this wallpaper is a work that we discussed making in 2011, which we never ended up making together. And what you'll notice, I mean, he committed suicide in 2010, but what you'll notice about this wallpaper, it's a very difficult wallpaper because it's incredibly beautiful. But it's also incredibly tragic. So well, you'll notice that each of the cuckoos has a kind of a noose around its neck, and if that one of them takes off, that they all basically kill each other. So it's a very kind of like slightly romantic, slightly tragic, very existential kind of work. But it took me a long time to feel comfortable enough showing it. And this is a work which is a kind of a double work by Vlatko Horvat. So it kind of exists in this form and in this form. So it kind of almost occupies 2 rooms, even though the actual sculpture itself is just the same uprights. And then we come back to the main room again, and then we're there. So just want to go back to firstly just talk very quickly about. Have you got 25 minutes, or have you got 20 minutes left in you? 25. It means that if we do 20, we will be going straight into escape. If we do 25, I'll talk about attentiveness before that. Okay, 25. So in a way, I'm trying to maybe slow things down a little bit with this exhibition, but also in terms of thinking about exhibitions more widely, like how closely do we actually look at things? How closely do we look at the relationship between things? How closely do we imagine the kind of the weight of this painting sitting on the weight of this wall? So when this exhibition comes down, the wallpaper is brutally and violently scraped off this white wall. So it's brutally and violently scraped off this white wall. It takes maybe 2 weeks to take it down. It takes maybe a day to put it up. It takes maybe a month to produce the wallpaper. So there's a lot of energy that goes into to transforming the white walls of this gallery into an exhibition. And then transporting this single painting across the oceans, unraveling it, putting it up, and it's just like one point of contact. It's just this one moment where it goes onto the wall and it gathers this weight. And then it's brutally taken down, it's put back into its tissue paper, into its bubble wrap, into its crate, and then into its preservational state. It goes back to being art again, because ultimately the fundamental way in which art kind of exists is in crates, in storage, in people's houses, underneath the basements of galleries, in the basements of museums. That is the primary existence. That is the ontological state of art when it is not being exhibited. And I'm really trying to find ways in which like this kind of like the original state of art and its moment of exhibition can ultimately present, can transform each other. So this similarly, when this little girl activates this Mary Heilman chair, it stops being this kind of dead sculptural object in the middle of a gallery floor and becomes this other body, this other playful body which she's interacting with. When a single frame from a Daffy Duck film is extracted from all the other narrative structure that ultimately make its existence possible, when that's extracted and then projected or presented on a large screen on a wall, this tiny second of thinking, this moment of impossibility that Daffy is trying to imagine by the tapping of his head, but it's in this perpetual state of thinking. He's never going to actually arrive at a moment of conclusivity or a moment of knowledge. And I'm really interested in this thing that every time it's shown, it's different. Similarly with the Nina Canal, and similarly with the Eduardo Padilla. And these points of contact that kind of come into being. So what I'm, I suppose, trying to achieve with this kind of slowing down or this micro focusing on these moments of where these points of contact are made more visible is to think about curating as a form of attentiveness. So where not only where the curator and the artist are attentive to one another, but really thinking about the ways in which these sites of contact or these spaces of contact or these bodies in contact with other bodies have this kind of internal and external cohesion. And I'm going to talk, imagining this as a kind of, I've talked about this before, but imagining this as an exhibition. So this is an exhibition in the same way in which the Auger photographs are exhibitions. So when one radical state of transformation is articulated in a singular image in the Auger photograph, similarly with this painting by Frans Hals, there's this moment in which there's a complete transformation of the idea of group portraiture. This is a group portrait from the 16th century by Frans Hals. And in 1902, the Viennese art historian Alois Riegel applied, who many of you should know and will know, an understanding of attentiveness to the dynamics of these kinds of group portraiture. And in the way in which I'm trying to be attentive to what happens when the painting and the weight of it sits on the wallpaper, that little girl sits on the chair, or when Eduardo's sleeping bags are placed on the floor, what happens, what is being attended to? What is it that's internally and externally cohering when why do they make sense together? Why does it look so good? What is it that makes it an exhibition and extracts it from its preceding identity as a kind of a dead artwork? So for Riegel, a group portrait was neither an expanded an expanded version of an individual portrait, so one singular individual portrait, nor a family portrait. But he said it was like an extension of the individual portrait, but also a mechanical collection of individual portraits in one singular representational image. So it always moved between these kind of representation of free association of autonomous independent individuals. So in a way in which like each of the figures in a Frans Hals painting are doing something independent of one another, but they're also attending to each other. So you'll see this very strange looking baby down here. She's holding this kind of apple or peach or pear or whatever, but also looking over at somebody over here. This guy here is like holding this kind of glove, so he's doing something very unique and individual to himself, but he's also looking at somebody maybe over there. But he's also, as you notice, got his hand around the back of this female figure who has her hand on his leg, and she's looking at somebody maybe outside. Then you have like these two figures here looking at one another, but also kind of this woman here is looking at somebody over here. This woman, as well as being attentive to this man here in terms of placing her hand on his leg, she's also looking at somebody over here, but she's also tickling this little boy here, and this little boy here is like looking down at this little girl here, and this little girl here is looking up at this little boy here. So there's all these kind of moments of like where there's this individual acts of like autonomous projection, but at the same time they're attending to one another. So this is what he calls the internal coherence. So they internally cohere in terms of their attentiveness. But he also articulated that there is an external coherence. So this external coherence is where the individuals within the group become attentive to those around them. So as you can see, they're being attentive to each other. But beyond that, they also are attentive to that which is outside the frame and beyond those who are being depicted in the portrait. So this attentiveness is achieved, what for Rigel, and what I'm maybe trying to achieve with this thinking around the exhibition as a form, is that there's a kind of an attentiveness achieved through an equal consideration of the dynamics of, say, the compositional arrangements inside the group portrait, and the psychological exchanges within the group. So when all these kind of bodies, these artists, come into contact with one another, like visit each other, socialize with one another, but also when the things that they make come into contact with other things that other artists make, there are these kind of narrative devices kind of introduced that make these kind of connections between these different bodies or these different ontological states. But the concept of attentiveness, I think can be applied only when it kind of externally coheres. So when the actual viewer or the spectator or the person who's actually being looked at by these various figures are brought into the group portrait. So the third element, the element that Robin Morris kind of insisted upon, and Duchamp insisted upon, that insistence on the viewer and the spectator as being part of the work or part of the group portraiture in this sense. So there's an internal coherence in terms of the relationship between individual bodies in this portrait, but also an external coherence where you are being brought into the painting in some particular way. And this is maybe what I'm trying to achieve with that. And I'm trying to achieve that primarily through not only thinking about what happens when these bodies come into contact with other bodies, but how they escape from being themselves and are transformed through their coexistence with one another by these kind of sites of contact being supported. So now we're going to escape. So you said 25 minutes, so now it'll be 20 minutes. Are we still okay with 20 minutes? You do look quite attentive there. So what I'm going to ask you to do, is to try and escape. So to try and imagine yourself elsewhere, but also to remain here. So in the way in which what I've done actually is I've escaped a little bit. So I've kind of gone back in time. I've like looked at these images, some old ideas, some new ideas, But I'm yet to be kind of completely transformed by them because I don't yet know. And escape is always this perpetual state of both leaving and returning at the same time. And what I'm going to do is exactly what you're going to do, but you'll do it differently to me. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read the text. You're not going to read text. I'm going to read the text that's going to describe an experience of an artwork that I was transformed by. One, so I want you to think about an artwork. It can be any artwork. It can be a good artwork, a bad artwork. It could be something you experienced when you were small, something you experienced today. But I want you to think about that artwork. If you can't think about it for the whole duration of me reading this text, that's fine. But I want you to at least think about it, or to try and think about it, to bring that which is not here into the room, into your brain, into your thinking, into your basic state of being. Second thing I want you to do, which is the second thing that I'm also going to describe, I'm going to describe a feeling, but a feeling that has a relationship with a particularly, in my case, a particularly traumatic experience. I'm not asking you to feel this traumatic experience, but what I want you to do is to basically feel something. So think about an experience that made you feel really strongly. Hatred, anger, pain, laughter can also be a very, very, very strong kind of feeling. I'm not asking you to think about affect at all. For all you affect theorists out there, I'm rejecting affect theory just for a second. We're just thinking about feelings. So a feeling, it could be an emotional state brought about by a feeling, that's okay. But if you can try and imagine those two things, and what I'm suggesting with the juxtaposition of these two things is that when you go into a room and you look at an artwork, sometimes you can be really transformed by it based on the fact that you're bringing in this feeling or this emotional state. Sometimes you can go in and look at that William McKeown painting and it's just nothing happening. Sometimes you can go in and look at it and go, fucking hell, that's like overwhelming. So I'm asking you to basically just try and bring two things together. A feeling, a feeling based on a moment that you were really transformed by, and secondly, to bring an artwork in and to really think hard about that artwork. The third thing that I want you to do, I want you to tell me whether you want the shorter or the longer version of this. How long do you need to escape? How long do you need to escape? 3 hours. And we're not going to be here for 3 hours. 4 pages or 5 pages? 5 is fine, okay. Okay, so 5 we go a little bit deeply. And what I'm going to do is the text that I'm going to read is going to basically bridge various different ways in which theoretical fields articulate the same thing. So I'm going to move between feminist theory to queer theory to affect theory to psychology to art theory to art history to subjective studies. So basically keep on describing the same thing, the same experience, the same artwork over and over and over and over again, but in relation to the one word, which is the word escape. So in a way, I'm going to try and escape, but also articulate what it is to escape when thinking about an individual artwork, an individual experience, and all these different fields of inquiry and the way in which they try to articulate or describe escape in different ways. The fourth thing I'm going to ask you to do, which is, I do not want you to look. So there is no looking. So the looking that's going to happen is going to be internal. However difficult you might find that, tough. So it's like you're going to look internally. You can look externally, you can bring the thing which is not here into your mind, or you can try and find it. But I do not want you to look at me. I will not look at you. I swear I will not look at any of you. I also don't want you to look at each other. So wherever way you're looking, if you're keeping your eyes open, I do not want you to look. So no looking at each other, no looking at me, You're just going to listen to my words, and you're going to listen to your artwork, your experience, and we're going to try and escape. Are we okay with that? Come on, guys. Okay, so could we dim the lights or something? Is that too radical? No, we can't dim the lights. Okay. Maybe we could turn out those lights or those lights. You'll just have to try and escape without any other techniques. Okay. So, just to remind you to think about a work or an artwork that you've been transformed by, and secondly, a feeling attached to an emotional state, whether it be traumatic or exhilarating, one way or ecstatic. But just to try and basically imagine those two things coexisting with one another. It's not me, it's you. Sorry, my apologies. I meant to say, it's not you, it's me. Or is that the way it goes? I can never remember correctly. It is one of my memory blocks, one of my default settings that always seems to get in the way. Was it you facing me or me facing you when we both stood there, opposite each other? You facing me and me facing you when we both stood there. And one of us said something like that. Which one of us was looking to find a way out? Neither of us would admit to looking for the door, the exit, quickly enough. Somehow it was too late, before we realized that it was each other, us, you and me, who were getting in each other's way. Where did we come in? How could we get out? Preferably, separately, without each other's knowing. But now we knew we just could not escape each other, nor from where we were. There was no way around, no way backwards, no way forwards, nor left, nor right, no up, no down. All sense of direction, even up and down, seemed impossible to decipher. Looking back, I think it was something to do with desire, wanting to visualize ourselves differently. It is this idea of escape, even the mere word itself, that releases us from something. Then language is complicit with our need to be able to at least imagine ourselves elsewhere. Linked to the sense of failure and disappointment with the world, the concept of escape is often perceived of as an act of release or liberation from something, from somewhere, or from someone, accompanied by the wish to be transformed. It is a word that makes us grateful. We are thankful that we can, in fact, escape. It makes it possible for us to imagine an alternative. The act of escape entails a productive practice of illusory disappearance and the possibility of a displacement of the self. When I think of the phenomenon of escape, it appears to be bound up in our earliest experiences of play, undermining many of our childhood games, from hide and seek to blind man's bluff or kiss and chase. In each scenario, there is an innate tension between the desire to be caught and to get away. There is an inherent psychological paradox as much as a regulatory modality to escape. The skill when hiding is to make it interesting to be found rather than to try to avoid being found altogether. The game fails if the seeker gives up or the hider disappears. These are transgressions of the psychic economy of the game, where everyone is reassuringly found in the end. In a successful game of hide and seek, everyone is found. No one, in fact, escapes. Play is always reliant upon us not being too elusive, not being too good, not being too bad. Play should always retain an amateurish or even childish dimension. We must never extract ourselves completely from the game, or we will be lost forever. There is a psychology of tentative escapology, where the practice of avoidance is the condition of preparation, awaiting to be eventually revealed. Illusion, elusiveness, and artful dodgery go hand in hand. with an inevitable failure to stay hidden or out of the game. When we consider this ontology of play and how it might relate to life, that is to our life, or what Levinas calls the pleasant game of life, which ceases to be just a game, it is not that real suffering or real pain threatens life in a displeasing or unpleasant way. Rather, it is because the grounding of suffering itself consists of the impossibility of interrupting life, of escaping it, and its acute feeling of being held fast, being unable, or it reminds us of the impossibility of getting out of the life as reality game, and of giving back to things their toy-like usefulness, which is bound to and heralds from the precise early moment of one's life, such as the moment when an infant comes to becoming a toddler, when infancy comes to an end and begins to define the very notion of seriousness as part of growing up. We have to get serious to grow up. What counts then is in all this experience of being is the inescapability of life itself, growing up and its very constraints, its social conventions, its realities. So the need to escape is our recognition of this inevitability, where the act of escape or flight from our becoming, from our reality, is a search for refuge. It is not a matter of getting out of life, but also of going somewhere. It is a spatial as much as a temporal metaphor. On the contrary, the need to escape is found to be identical at every juncture to which its adventure leads us, it as it needs be. It is as though the path it travels could not lessen its own dissatisfaction with the reality of which the adventure tries to lead us away from, towards somewhere else. Therefore, our need to escape, being itself, appears not only as an obstacle that free thinking has to surmount or to overcome, rather it appears as an imprisonment from which one must get out. As according to Levinas, for example, it is existence which is the absolute that asserts itself without reference to anything else. Escaping is when the I of existence wants to get out of itself, but does not flee itself as a limited being. Escape puts into question the peace with self as a general entity, since it aspires to break the chains of the I to the self. It is being itself, or the one self, from which escape flees. In escape, the I flees itself, not in opposition to the affinity of what it is not, or what it will not become, but rather due to the very fact that it is, or that it becomes. Escape, therefore, is the very inner structure of our being as forms of self-positing. It is a reminder that the event of our individual lives are masking the inevitability of all life as something which is time-limited or comes to an end. Escape can be a stepping outside of this time limitation, of lifetime, but it is always deceptive. Like all immediate pleasures, it folds in on itself, and it is within a moment of its own experience, but we inevitably fail to escape from ourselves. Escape is also about being in two places at once, or ourselves in two times at the same time. So what has this got to do with art and its artistic terms, or when art is being exhibited or practiced? If we were to think back to the idea of a game as an important extension of both the game of life and what Levinas called the pleasant game of life, which ceases to be just a game, then by extension, art as just a game that is not played or is played, not in a facetious way, but really as something we choose to play, to be part of, and that becomes part of our pleasure. It brings us pleasure. It brings something into us, but also as something which allows us to go elsewhere, to escape. I would say that the concept of escape is perhaps best embodied in the ready-made, that which is not here, which, from Duchamp to Koons, has brought about the object's complete extraction from the world, its temporal removal, and its reconceptualization, leading to an adjustment of its value in the world, so it moves from the world into the world. The role of the ready-made as that which is adopted from already existing things in the world proffers an updated of the figure of the artist or curator as escapologist, that is more Houdini than Bastionado. Simultaneously, the artist or curator as escapologist engages in acts of removal and renewal in which there is a slippage or constant slippage between concealing, resurrecting, and being uncovered, performing multiple selves and something to do with fragmented subjectivities. Seemingly ordinary, mundane things get away from being themselves without ever losing sight of what they once were. Actors become spectators, we become observers of ourselves. Playing becomes image and form. The room, the gallery becomes a strange game. A game becomes a space of display. The temporal dimension of playtime collapses into a multiplicity of time images, of moments, of body parts, of abstractions, of desiring bodies, and of game times into a proprioceptive coherence. Like the tennis player whose racket becomes part of their body, the images and the games become extensions of each other as they collapse into one another. Escapology provides a sense of melancholic transportation. The artwork that you are thinking of engages in a double game, a shifting to and fro of associations. Fear of an art world or fear of a world being lost forever is paralleled with an equally persuasive desire to be rediscovered differently. The thing which is not here, the thing which you are trying to imagine now, is not really a game, but many games, whilst not being a game at all. We become the things around us, which surround us, whilst they are revealed as both themselves and something more than they once were. The locus of the end game hides in many places, people, things, actions, and times at once. Almost getting lost, but always wanting to be found. The thing which is not here will never be here, but is already. As a box of tricks invested in an economy in the exchange economy of signs, both objects and bodies in action are at once familiar and strange. Employing certain tactics such as removal or revelation or displacement or dismantling, there is a reconfiguration. Elements are recharged, rethought, and redeployed at every time within an exhibition. There is a reimagining of things and actions as they are differently, so that the resultant end work provides an uncanny sense both of its own belonging within and its separateness from the world from which it derives and the para-world it has now invented. It is neither a gallery nor a game, exhibition nor site, but perhaps all of these things at once. Instead, the gallery plays its own cameo role as that which is not here in a kind of game, and the game becomes a kind of gallery of activities, actions, social interactions, and multiple modes of spectation and consumption. As a latter-day incarnation of the ready-made, the exhibition as a form of escape is a withdrawal of the notion of artistic value as a stable form of individual expression embodied in material practice, with the resultant work manifesting itself as a rejection of the mimetic capacity of the artist to reflect social life through their own hand. Based on an understanding of post-autonomous production as the foundation of art after Duchamp, there is a process of production in which the delegation of non-artistic labor to others is aligned with the artist's intent. For example, players or audience members become actors or agents of the artist and vice versa. The artwork becomes a site of potential escape for both. That is, its production becomes an escape for both. The artist becomes a producer, as does the curator, through the site of the commission. It is perhaps representative of a collapse of the division between intellectual labor and manual labor as the basis for the future dissolution of art into social practice that began with the early avant-garde. Productive labor and immaterial labor dissolve into co-productive practice so that art can extend itself beyond alienated aestheticism. Here, the notion of escape is opened up at the point of artistic production, with the dispersal of the artist's hand into forms of heteronymous labor, enabling a dissolution as much as a displacement of the artists from the center of their own ownership or their own authorship. This is a radical disjuncture at the heart of modern practice after the ready-made, and as such is what distinguishes the modern from the pre-modern. The fact that at the moment of dissolution of its traditional forms, art invites both productive and non-productive labour into its realm as a means of reflecting upon the conditions of both art and labour under capitalist relations. The assimilation of the worker into the artist and the artist into the worker is a transformation of the alienated character of both, a two-way escape from predetermined identities. Although there is a seeming rejection of authorship in their traditional sense when art is being exhibited and moves away from modes of autonomous production, there is a diffusion rather than a refusal of authorship. Something is being made through instruction, construction, invention, rule setting and breaking, alteration and deception. For although there are multiple actors and agencies at work in the game which is not here, in the game of that which is not here, the thing which you are now imagining that is difficult to bring, and these make up the work, whereby multiple social relations become dissolved into a disembodied spectacle. From the perspective of that which is not here, there is a kind of imported remoteness to this particular experience of escape. As I've said, it's not you, and it's not you, it's me. We can therefore escape in an act of release or liberation from something, from somewhere, or someone, from this place and this time, for a moment, which will always be accompanied by some kind of wish to be transformed. But we cannot escape from ourselves. We can become abstracted, we can get out of it, off our heads if you like, out of the game, but not out of our heads or out of ourselves. Escape is always a space of returning, coming back, coming down, no matter how immersive the experience of getting lost, no matter how high, how removed from the here and now. The act of escape always brings us back to the pre-immersive space, back to where we were, only with the sound of the din ringing in our ears. Then afterwards we remember, it was not you, it was me after all.